You are listening to MCC GeoPod, the geopolitical podcast of the Mathias Corvinus Collegium, the largest talent management institute in Hungary. If you want to know more about our mission, please look up our English website at mcc.hu/en or check out our Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter channels. For interesting articles and analysis of our professors and students, look up our knowledge base at corvinus.hu/en.
All right, so welcome everybody. This is the MCC GeoPod podcast. I am your host, Zsolt Sitkei, and joining me today, Mathias Vigoczki, who works for the MCC Center for Geopolitics, expert on Russia, and a student of geopolitics PhD program at Pécs University.
Hello, I'm happy to be here.
Mathias, you are writing your doctoral dissertation in connection with one of the most widely read events of recent weeks. After the Darja Dugina assassination, the work of her father, Alexandr Dugin, received a lot of attention. And your research focuses on this theory. Can you briefly explain why this theory is important? Even what is this theory is talking about?
Well, I'm focusing on this ideology, which is Neo-Eurasianism, which is really hard to spell even in English or in Hungarian, because this is something like a state mission, like a mission of Russia in the whole world. First, I met the idea of state mission of Russia even before I heard about Dugin. In the history, Russia usually had some kind of ideology, some kind of mission in the world. It was the communism in the Soviet time, or it was the Eastern Orthodoxy, or gathering the Russian land even before. But what we are seeing today is a Russian state which has no official ideology. And I think that Dugin's theory would like to be some kind of state ideology, or would like to be an idea which can give a mission for the Russian state in the world. And for me personally, it was extremely interesting. And I wanted to focus on this even before I've been to Russia.
And actually, on a personal note, I think you know Dugina. Is that true?
Yes, I believe that if somebody would like to become an expert, he or she has to visit the country as much as he or she can. And he or she also needs to know the persons you are focusing on. And the first time when I've been to Russia, it was 5 years ago. And I used social media to get in contact with Dugini circles. And since her daughter was extremely active on the social platforms, she immediately replied to me, and she was open to meet with me. And I get new with her and with some of her colleagues. But I would like to emphasize that we were not friends. We just met a couple of times. And for me, she was a very well-educated person. As far as I know, she studied in France. I can say she was very cosmopolitan, even if she said that she is a conservative Russian person. She was just at the beginning of her career as a public person, and she was running from one meeting to another meeting. But for me, this experience was on one hand interesting, and on one hand it was a bit shocking, because at one of our meetings I met with a German journalist, namely Manuel Oxenreiter, who was for me unknown person. But 1 year later, I read his name in the newspapers because his name was connected with an attack in Zakarpattia, in Carpattia in Hungarian, in Ukraine, against a Hungarian culture center. This attack was committed by two Poles, but these young people told at the jury that this German journalist gave them the orders how and why to attack this Hungarian cultural center. So after I read this news, I was shocked that I met this person with Dugina in Moscow, in this center of the ideology. And of course, I was shocked, a bit terrified, but I thought that I have some kind of responsibility to research more this topic because it is extremely important even for Hungary as well.
And following the assassination, Dugin was pictured by the media as this brain of Kremlin. And what do you think about this?
I think that if you read Russian news, you won't read that Dugin is the brain of the Kremlin. I think this statement is a clear example of how simplistic we think about the Kremlin and how does Russia works. While one hand, it is true that the decision-making in Moscow is in one man's hand, namely in Putin, and others are losing influence. On the other hand, I think that the Kremlin is still a very complex place, and there are no people whispering into Putin's ears. So I don't think that Dugin is the one person who makes the greatest influence on Putin. In my opinion, Dugin is much less known and less popular in Russia as we think, and even less known in Ukraine. I have to admit that his earlier works were mostly known by the intellectuals, and I didn't find yet any evidence that Dugin served as the advisor for Putin. But it is, if you read the news, I think in every second news site it is mentioned that he served as the advisor of Putin, but I cannot find any evidence of it. But I also have to admit that it is his merit that the geopolitical thinking spread in the 19th Russia. So we can say that his works are in some way influential even in the Kremlin, even if Dugin personally has no connection to Putin. But at the moment, Dugin has no governmental position in Russia. And I should emphasize that he couldn't even hold his academic job in 2014. So I think that he is a bit neglected person. And so from this point, I doubt that, as the Russian officials first stated, that Ukraine wanted to assassinate him because he is not a top person in Russia. And after a while of the bombing in 20th of August, the officials in Russia stated that the target was his daughter, Dugina, who is, in my opinion, even less known in Russia and in Ukraine as well, even if she was regularly seen on the national television. So honestly, I have no clue whose interest was this attack.
And with this limited influence you mentioned, what do you think, to what extent is this geopolitical thinking, his theory, is reflected in the Russian political narrative and in its foreign policy?
The neo-Eurasianism is an all-encompassing and umbrella ideology for me. It says that liberalism, fascism, and communism was already tried in Russia, but all of these political branches have failed in Russia. And according to Dugin, they need a new political school, a new political idea. And the neo-Eurasianism could be this. But if we look at what this ideology says about the world, we can say that it resembles in some way to the earlier mentioned Russian state ideas, namely communism, orthodoxy, or gathering the Russian lands. And in some way, this Dugin's idea would like to unite many parts of these ideas. If you would like to look at the world like Dugin sees it, the world is inhabited by nations. And these nations, like Hungarian nation, the Russian nation, they are building up civilizations. And these are the super nations. He says that there are ethnos and super ethnos. And for Dugin, for example, in Russia, there are a lot of nations, and the Russian is only one of them. And these nations organically build up a civilization, which is Russian civilization or Eurasian civilization, Russian, Eurasian, you can call whatever you want. And he says that this civilization is not part of the West and not part of Asia. It is somewhere between, somewhere unique, but it is a sovereign nation, a sovereign civilization. From this point of view, Dugin says that the world needs to stand on the multipolarity of these civilizations, because according to Dugin, it is very unhealthy for the nations. This is how he says unhealthy for the nations if only one civilization is leading the world, namely at the moment the West, namely the United States of America. And therefore we need a multipolar world. And this is the mission of the Russian state, to promote the multipolarity, to promote other civilization, because if we could make a world where these civilizations are equal, it will make the world much safer, according to Dugin, because from the Kremlin, the world sees a very dangerous place, because the Western civilization, because of its unipolar dominance, the world is full of wars started by the West. Therefore, we need world peace, and therefore we need equality between the civilizations. And to achieve this, Russia needs to step foot in the region. Russia needs to be a strong actor in the region. This is the reason why Ukraine is so important for Dugin and from the Kremlin as well. But I think that Dugin and his idea is much more imperialistic and much more extreme than the Kremlin today, because Dugin advocates total decoupling from the West, even in economic terms and even in technological terms. So it promotes some kind of isolation from the West, much more than it is seen today. Anyway, I think that Dugin's ideas are, like an umbrella ideology. It has a lot of parts, and I think that the Kremlin is cherry-picking some elements. So it is not taking all of it, because it would be just too much. And the Kremlin doesn't want to be bound to one strict ideology, but it can use a very flexible, we can say fluid ideology, and just cherry-picking some elements from it. It can be imperialistic, and we can say that, yes, today Russia in some way is following neo-Eurasianist way, but I think this is not the whole truth. Russia at the moment has many projects, and some of them, some steps in the foreign policy are founded by the neo-Eurasianist ideology, but not all of them. I think the Kremlin just tries how it can use this idea, and if it is unusable, it will throw it away. It already happened in 2014 when the Kremlin almost followed Dugin's ideas to create so-called states in eastern Ukraine. But this project failed pretty quickly. And, the Kremlin threw away all these projects and even Dugin himself.
So do you think this theory won't stay relevant in the future?
It depends on how this war will end, and it depends on how the political elite will change in Russia. I don't think that we will experience any radical change in the Kremlin. And if the isolation from the West will continue, the Kremlin will need some foundation to find reasons why it is good to follow this way of isolation. And I think since this umbrella ideology, neo-Eurasianist element can be used for this reason. So neo-Eurasianist in the future can be used for isolation, but also can be used for a worldwide Russian mission as well. And I think in the future, the Kremlin will still cherry picking from it. If the isolation continues, it will, use more element according to today. But if there will be some change, some pro-Western change, which is, I think at the moment is really hard to imagine, well, then Dugin and his ideas will be again extremely marginalized.
And as for my last question, the assassination of Dugin was, let's say, beneficial for propaganda. Do you think this is the time for oppression in Russia?
Well, I read the Telegram channels right after the Dugin's assassination, and almost every media person mentioned that we need to retaliate Ukrainians. We need to send more forces to Ukraine because of this attack. We shouldn't forget that this attack happened in Moscow or near to Moscow. So it was not near to the front. It was in the capital. And these media persons also mentioned that we need to continue our fight not just against the foreign enemies, namely in Ukraine, but against our enemies inside the country. And for me, it sounded more terrifying, because it means that Russia, these circles need that Russia should put more pressure on the opposition, on everybody who is opposing this war. So yes, I think that this attack is a reason why to oppress more the political sphere in Russia. And we shouldn't forget that the next election, which is at the 11th of September in Russia, will be organized in a very cold atmosphere. So there are no real strong opposition figures in Russia at all. But after the war and after the Dugin's assassinations, these opposition figures are less and less important, and they get weaker.
I'm afraid our time is up. Thank you so much for this discussion. And for our listeners, thank you for tuning in, and see you soon.
I was happy to be here.
Thank you for listening to this MCC GeoPod episode. For further media content, please look up our English website at mcc.hu/en, or look for us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you want to read more by our professors and students, check out our knowledge base at corvinus.hu/en.